residential neighborhood district isn't changing drastically. It's still mostly residential. There are some small scale, low impact office and retail uses that would be allowed as conditional use with DRB approval in conjunction with a residential use. So, but I'm showing you this area in yellow, the Green Street, Frost Street, Willow Street area, because this is an area that had previously been zoned multiple residential. And so the table there no longer allowed, with the uses that are no longer allowed, were allowed in the multiple residential. So you could have an open market, a media broadcast facility, theaters, fitness clubs, there's some retail there.
Can I ask a really dumb question? You couldn't put like a park and ride in a residential area? Or could you?
Where'd that come from?
Is there something,
She doesn't want to know.
if you have a project in mind,
Do you have something in mind?
Like park and ride.
I'm just trying to,
Parking,
of all the things,
surface parking.
park and ride.
Yeah.
No, look at it.
No, you cannot have surface parking. You couldn't create a surface.
you couldn't.
You couldn't create a park and ride because it
Right.
would just be surface
But
parking.
you could put an underground garage.
Right.
Can I put a pancake house here? How about an IHOP?
No IHOP.
Yeah.
No IHOPs.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll write that into.
We did actually, during the meetings that we had in January, February timeline, get feedback from residential neighborhood residents who were keen to keep the district probably more solidly residential
Yeah,
than
they-
it is actually in this draft. So I don't know that we heard some. We definitely had people come in and say less non-residential
retail,
uses.
yeah.
I don't know if we had anyone come in and say they wanted some non-residential use.
I mean, it's a really
Yeah.
important.
No, we did get more, like, we used to have bank as a conditional use, we
Right.
had more retail. The retail is kind of limited to the High Street, kind of Western Ave, where there is, it's an existing residential office district, I think, so, yeah, there was some strong feedback about not allowing too much retail, or non-residential.
Wasn't also, I remember, and I could be remembering the wrong area, that's very possible, but I remember this information staying with me, that there was that section across from the Common where the thinking was it would be good to actually increase
Yes.
visibility
I'm gonna
and
show you
some
that,
traffic
it might be
flow.
next.
Because I loved that idea.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Okay.
I just
Right.
loved it. I think it's so smart to think about who's seeing what part of the town in terms of
Right.
That's a
visibility
perfect
and
transition.
It's a great segue. Thank you very much.
You're
Here we are.
welcome. You're very welcome.
Did they pay you to say that?
No, they did not. They did not.
She hasn't been here.
So the mixed-use district is one of our new districts. It consolidates several underlying zoning that has disappeared or we're proposing will disappear. So this was previously residential office, in which case you could have offices, but there was no retail uses that were allowed in this area. And it also had to be, I think, office in combination with residential. So the purpose of the mixed-use district is to provide flexibility for the creative and efficient use of land and buildings while protecting and enhancing the historic and neighborhood character. So in this particular, because this was residential office, in addition to kind of all the underlying residential uses and offices that were allowed in residential office, now it would be allowed to have shops and stores, banks, restaurants, personal services. So
What
these would be
streets are those?
new uses.
What streets are these?
Yeah.
Is that what
Oh,
you're
sorry,
asking?
that's the Common, the
Yeah,
Brattleboro
just
Common, and
Park
then
Place and up Canal Street, right?
Near
Yes,
the
so this is the courthouse,
Close
Oh, yeah,
to the
okay.
O'Connor
No,
Club.
but
That's
here.
what I'm asking.
Yeah.
and then it goes down Terrace Street,
Okay.
yeah, it takes into the
and then cuts back up, and then it
Office
comes.
Club.
It's really just either side of the urban center.
Right.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
well, I'm just trying to figure out what streets.
Yes.
'cause I
Yeah,
can't
sorry,
figure
I
it out.
should have already.
Right, and so that's actually an important point too. So on either side of the urban centre is an important distinction, because what we're trying to do is, if you like, you imagine a gradient. So downtown is very dense, lots of commercial and retail activity, and all the things that go with that, both good and bad in terms of congestion and noise and so forth. And then you transition through a mixed-use district where the blend of mixes is quite similar, and so is but the density is beginning to reduce some. There's still a lot of amenity. It's still a tight neighborhood with good walkability and so forth. And then beyond that, it becomes more clearly residential. And so, by designating it this way, we're trying to give that. To acknowledge the wishes of the people in residential neighborhoods that they would like to preserve the residential character, but also broaden the range of uses that could happen in the mixed-use district, and then control for anything that needs to be mitigated through explicit design standards.
So these are two other mixed-use districts. The one on the left is on Canal Street. It takes into account, let's see, we have, this is Belmont, and these are some current doctor's offices here, and it goes across the street to Lexington Avenue. And then this is, let's see, we've got Oak Grove Avenue here, so the, is that the nursing home?
Yes, it's the Pine
Heights. Yeah, and then along the street to,
It takes in the pizza shop closest to the Walgreens.
yeah, that's right, it's okay.
Exit one
This
pizza.
picture, that's kind of the edge, the pizza shop.
So-
This is it's currently zoned commercial.
But where on the other side, on the downtown side, where does it go up to the
Takes in
laundromat or to Tyler's?
No, it descends.
It ends at the hospital
It ends at the
here.
hospital.
Right.
Right, and then
And then this
So
other
is that
zone,
Pine Street or,
No,
Oak Grove.
the hospital is the IT.
right,
yes.
yeah.
So
Then closer to town,
getting closer to town, where does this mixed use end?
Oh, that's the next
that's the
slide.
biggest one, yeah.
Is that?
I'll show you that
Awesome.
Yeah,
next.
yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, all right. We can jump there now if you want, unless people have questions about
I've got a
this.
couple.
So, right now, Lotus Graphics is in commercial, and
Yes.
it's gonna go to mixed use.
Yes,
Right.
and
Right.
it would still be allowed,
Right,
as with
and-
the antique motorcycle restoration
Mhm.
business behind it.
Mhm.
Okay, because that's that's also a very neighborly thing to have.
So.
Wow.
So for the commercial districts, it's
It
kind of
is.
more restrictive. You
Like
couldn't
bike
have the
fits.
hotel, motel, you can't have gas stations in there, auto sales, warehousing, mini storage, and marina.
So,
Probably not a problem if that's
It's-
just
I
mixed
think
use.
we
I was gonna say, it's gonna be hard to get a marine in there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so this is, like, are there any gas stations now in this zone?
Nope.
So,
not exactly, no.
No.
So all
They-
those, like,
Across
the
the
golf
street.
station and all
There
that kind
might,
of stuff?
is there a gas station
The
here?
mobile is.
Because
So,
No.
so from the
The
Citgo
mobile
to the
shop.
Irving is all in the neighborhood center or the service center?
The Irving is
in
in
the
the
service
service
center.
center, and the,
No, they're in the neighborhood center.
Well, the golf
Because
station,
there's
The
a golf
Irving, sorry,
station.
the
golf
Irving is in
Irving
the
is the
service
service.
center.
and
Is in
the
there,
yeah.
Mobile is in
and-
the neighborhood
And the
center.
Shell is in the neighborhood center, as
And
is
they're,
the, as is the golf over
as
the
the
road.
golf, and they're allowed, they're conditional or allowed there?
In the neighborhood center,
Well, if it goes to,
Or are they
if it goes to
prohibited?
Pine
They
Heights, though,
are
the golf
conditional.
station has to
they're
be in
conditional
there.
uses.
Conditional, okay.
Yeah.
Wait, can we go back a second? I'm still
Sure.
confused. If the,
Golf.
if the mixed use
Yes.
on Canal Street goes to Pine Heights, then the golf station has to be
it is.
in it.
It's the next, no,
No.
The golf
that's the
station
next
is-
one south.
But isn't it, maybe, Donna, am I
The
crazy?
hospital's in between.
I can get out.
No,
Actually-
because
No,
it
no, no.
goes
It's on the
Lotus
same
Graphics,
Right.
You've got Lotus
GPI
Graphics.
Construction,
Right,
Golf
Golf
Station.
Station.
And they just redid their store.
Right,
Yeah.
and then there's like,
Isn't that
Yeah.
a canopy?
And then it becomes residential
it's
for a
I think it is
while,
a canopy.
and mixed
No,
use.
There's a veterinary.
We think
The
this is the
veterinary
canopy.
clinic.
We think this is the canopy to the golf
Golf station.
station right there, so it's
Is
just.
it across from?
no, the golf station's on the same side as Lotus Graphics.
Yes,
Yes, it
this is
Yeah.
the same side.
So,
So I don't get it.
so look, this is the, whoops.
This is way better. I can't
I
think of
updated
more
the picture for you.
micromanaging than
So this is the drugstore, the
Walgreens.
relatively new
Walgreens?
drugstore.
No,
right?
the
that's
Brattleboro
Brattleboro
Pharmacy.
Drugs.
Brattleboro
Pharmacy.
Right.
Right.
Okay,
yeah,
by the
it's a
pizza
drugstore,
place,
right.
Yeah.
okay.
This is the pizza shop. Out the back here
Okay.
Right.
is the hospital's satellite parking.
So right
lot,
across the street
right?
is,
Right across the street
the golf.
is the golf station.
Okay.
And this is the car wash area at the back end. This is somebody who's just left the car wash, right?
Yeah.
So that's the golf.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
So it's
neighborhood
just
center.
outside of it then.
So-
That's neighborhood center.
Right.
But
Then-
then where, how does Lotus Graphics, oh, I thought we were talking about Lotus Graphics is in this.
I think I
No,
made an
it's
error
neighborhood
in the.
center.
Oh.
okay,
Oh, okay.
all right.
So Lotus is in neighborhood
Center.
center. And
Scale.
it used to be commercial?
Right.
Right.
Yes,
So that's changed.
Right.
And that's
so
changed.
this lies up here.
Exactly.
yes.
Right. So this.
I
forget
should
about
take
this
that
image.
picture
Okay.
out. I
Well,
apologize.
that's- Yeah,
Right.
Rotate.
I thought the plan was to
Hey.
I'm
clarify
feeling-
things.
Yeah, I'm
So-
feeling good about being able to identify a gas station from the
Okay.
color of the canopy,
Okay.
which I've never seen before.
so we can have a parking lot
Okay.
there.
Now, can I have my parking
Parking lot.
lot?
Yeah,
Parking lot.
you can have a, yeah, so if you want a parking right I would
There you go.
put it here.
Okay,
Okay.
So this other mixed-use district here, this is Fairground, where I've got the pointer, and then this is the Irving Station, actually, I think, right here.
Yes.
And so it's a little area in between. It's currently zoned residential. We had a lot of discussion about this at the planning
that's
commission as
Generous
well.
Street, right, or,
Yes,
right,
I
Yes,
see, yep.
generous,
this is Generous,
Yeah.
yeah,
which is a very short street.
right.
yeah.
And then, this is the old house with apartments on the top floor and an insurance office on the first floor,
Did
right
that
in the
one over
corner.
too.
And where's Hannah and Steve's office?
This way.
Okay,
Past the high
There.
school.
Right.
Right, and this is the pool from McConnell Lodge,
okay.
Yeah.
not the pool.
That's scary.
So this is a small, there's a couple of parcels in here that were put into the mixed-use district as kind of a break and to serve as a buffer, because behind Generous Street, there is a residential neighborhood, so the idea was kind of to provide a little buffer between what goes on Canal Street and,
Because now you're
To
getting
the
to the
back
other side by
neighborhood.
the high school.
yes.
Seriously.
Yeah, and so for these parcels that are fronting either on Fairground or on Canal Street, there would be commercial uses, light industrial uses, some of the public assembly
So that's
uses.
changing the mixed use.
So there's more use for those parcels that are
It used to
fronting.
be commercial. So that used to be.
Residential.
Residential,
Yes.
and now it's changing to
That's
mixed.
broadening out in terms of
It's-
use.
It's broadening its use.
Have you gotten feedback about that part of town? Anybody come forward to express? No.
Now, can I ask just a stupid question? When you go from commercial to neighborhood center, does your uses, what you can use it for, shrink?
They change.
They
Well, I know.
There is,
good word.
It's not that the list is shorter, the list
Yeah.
is different, is what
Yeah.
I'd say. So the emphasis goes away from, there's more of an active discouragement for auto-oriented uses, and there's
Uh-huh.
more of an encouragement for pedestrian and neighborhood level activity.
Okay.
So to go back to that image from Putney Road, for instance, very long open access from the lot to the road would get closed up. So you would use a range of landscaping tools and other design requirements to actually make it more comfortable and safer for pedestrians to use the sidewalk. You would not, you would be changing the uses so that it was more of a walkable neighborhood. That's the, but it's still, it doesn't mean the elimination of commercial or retail activity. It just means the scale of it is oriented more actively towards pedestrian access than it is vehicular access.
Okay. And if somebody were to, a commercial business right now were to sell their building, the use that it's currently being used for, they could still do it if they sold it within a year? Is that what you said?
You can sell at any time. It's
Yeah.
that
You
if
can't be
the
doing
building becomes vacated for
Right.
more than a year and there's no activity there at all, then you are required to meet the new
New
zoning
standards, okay.
rules. In which case, then you can't,
Do what you
potentially can't do what you were doing before.
Okay.
It's almost like Brattleboro is set up in such a way because it's such an old town that you can argue different distinctions all over town. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's so many mixed uses all over you.
Well, I think one of the weirder things about it that's hard to get is that the whole purpose of the document is to recognize what's there
Right,
and then balance that off against where you'd like it to be.
right.
And that transition from where you are now to where you'd like to be is clearly what's been going on for a long time, because we've had zoning since the
Right.
1940s,
Yeah,
right? And so it's a big check-in moment about where we'd like to be. But we have to acknowledge that, you know, any of the existing uses are entitled to stay exactly where they are doing what they're doing.
right.
But nevertheless, the community is charting a direction that says, if and when it becomes possible, we'd like to see a change. And I think that if you like, the bones of this neighborhood, this area here, it's an old traditional layout, and it is highly suited to being brought back to a level of intensity of pedestrian use and other activity that's less car oriented. And I think we're going to get there whether we want to be or not, kind of thing, I think is where this is sort of going to some extent.
So I have a question and a comment also, which is it feels so important that someone is steering this process. I mean, it really, I think sitting through 4 education sessions on all the thought that goes into this has been a huge, important education for the board. But you also mentioned sort of observing how the townspeople's habits are changing. For example, shopping and, you know, where we take our cars to be repaired. How do you gather that data? Like, who does that, and how does that happen? That's so mysterious. Who's watching us?
Well, I feel like I need to make a confession.
They lied about all that.
No.
Just made it
We watch it really. That's our hang up. That's our obsessive compulsive disorder. That's where it's at.
It's just to observe people's habits.
Yeah, it's what we do. So
So interesting.
and then, you know, there's a lot of observation and reporting on it and measurement of it, not just even at the national level, but the international level. So some of the patterns and trends that you see playing out here, you can think of, you know, the terminology might be different, but the issues are the same in Canada, they're certainly the same in Australia. There's a lot of activity, you know, that broadly. And within our context of northern New England, there's a lot of observation, and it's something that the 3 of us have got in common as a kind of a compulsion. But you see play out, the other obvious, more objective measure is actually how the market responds. So there's been some availability of retail space in the Royal Plaza for more than 3 years.
Right,
There's
so nobody's
there's
chosen
always
to
about
buy.
30% of it vacant.
Yep.
There's the Home Depot that's been vacant for 5 or 6 years. There's small gas stations with repair shops that are associated with them that, you know, the mechanics walk away. You know, they're not using the bays for repairing autos anymore. They use it to store soda in, and they're selling soda out, you know. So you can look at old buildings and see them being repurposed slowly over time or put to a new use. The property over the road is a perfect example. You know, at some point it was a vibrant, you know, repair shop / fuel oil delivery service, and it's the entire front area of that building has become an office for the fuel oil service that remains there. There's no necessary reason for it to necessarily be there anymore, but you know, it's a legacy use. You could imagine that if we were here in the 1940s, it would have probably been a car yard, or at least an auto repair shop.
It was a bike shop.
And right.
So many of the zoning changes are simply responding to the
Right.
use changes that
Right.
have already
just did it.
occurred.
Yes.
And,
So the golf station here, this is a perfect example. It's just been recently remodeled. They've redone the landscaping. They've done a bunch of things. They preserved the car wash function at the back.
Yeah.
There's been a total reduction in the number of car washing locations in Brattleboro in the last 2 years. It's been pretty significant, but they preserved theirs.
They're one of the few with hoses.
That's right. That's very good. That's why we like them. So, and it's a convenience store inside. There's nowhere to get your car repaired. There's no one to give you advice or to help you fix your car. So that is the new pattern. It's a miniature convenience store
Right.
that sells gas, and it has a car wash. But 30 years ago, it would have been a repair shop
Right.
or something similar. So you can see that transition, and even things such as Lotus Graphics, a highly specialized business with a very kind of narrow purpose. They're doing fine. They've got a really good clientele and they work well. But even in the space of 10 or 15 years, I'm sure their work has really dramatically changed. People have either got their own printers or people just don't print anymore, right? So that you can see these.
But that's what, that times do that.
Right,
I mean,
and so, and it gets borne out in the way we use our buildings and the way we use our land. So, that's what we watch, I guess.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
More mixed use. So let me see if I can explain. So this is part of the big area, David. So this is the corner of Burr Street and Washington. And this takes into account the auto sales property here.
Yeah, these long, narrow, this is the awning over the autos, so.
And this is Minchall Street, the little narrow kind of alleyway that wraps around to Burge. So this takes into account Tyler's, and it goes all the way to Brook Street. This is Brook Street here. So this is currently zoned commercial, and it would be moved to mixed use.
That makes sense.
It would be, so you couldn't have a hotel or motel, no more gas stations, auto repair, boat repair, auto sales. It's not something we want to continue to encourage in this area. Obviously, it can continue to exist. Warehousing, mini storage.
So on the other side is still residential? I'm
On the other,
assuming?
this is
Yeah.
residential,
Residential,
yes.
and back in here is residential.
It's still residential?
Yeah.
And so, just to be clear, there's a gas station, there's
Yeah.
kind of a twin gas station set up on either side of Canal here.
Yep.
that-
That's conditional, or that's
That's conditional.
grandfathered and prohibited?
In mixed use, did we establish
What?
they're conditional, the gas stations? Or
No,
they're not
they would, those would be grandfathered, there would be no more.
Right.
And then this is the five-way intersection at the bottom of Union Hill. This is currently zoned commercial office, so, all the office and kind of the retail uses are preserved, but now it would also be allowed to have light industrial. So it takes into the Whetstone Arts Building.
And so that car wash that's no longer operating a year of no use once this ordinance is adopted means that it's can no longer be operated there.
Right.
So can I ask one thing about those gas stations? If those gas stations are sold, they will not be allowed?
No,
No.
Only if they're abandoned and
It's
that.
an oddly subtle thing, so
Yeah.
you can sell them, and as long as the new owner operates them as a gas station within a couple of months, the use can continue. If you sell them and they become vacant for more than 12 months, then you have to find a different use.
All right.
What if you don't sell them? If the current owner remains the owner but abandons the active use, after a year, do they lose the use?
Actually, when they change it to something, so if they abandon the gas station and then they immediately turn it into something that would be permitted or conditionally permitted they've abandoned the gas station use.
Right.
So they don't get a year to go back to that.
Right.
Once they've changed the use, it's,
Right.
But if they stop operating a gas station, but retain ownership of the property, and after 12 months, some additional period of time after 12 months,
They reactivate it,
the property changes hands,
Yeah.
does the new owner
Have a year?
have a year after acquiring the property to
No.
use it as a gas
It's
station?
irrespective of the ownership, so it's 12 months. It doesn't matter whether you sell it in that 12 months, you retain ownership. It's a 12 months of inactivity of the non-conforming use.
Okay, so even if the same owner decided, I guess I'm gonna start up a business again, if it was more than 12 months later, it'd have to be a new business.
There's plenty of businesses around Vermont that are open for one day every 12 months.
Yeah, that's right there. You just got the solution.
That's interesting.
Well, Brandy, thank you for that.
Yeah, write that down. I can come up with a list for you.
Yeah, and that's a widespread phenomenon.
Peter, you had a question. First person in the audience.
The question is, what happens?
Could you come to the microphone, please, so the listeners at home or the viewers at
The
home?
question is, what happens to a business if it burns down or wants to expand? If it's not.
It's not.
Do you want to answer that?
Thanks.
Yeah, so in those cases, the owner retains that right to reestablish the use and to rebuild, depending on the exact nature of the non-conformity, whether it was a non-conforming structure or just the use was non-conforming. If it's in the floodplain, it was taken out by a flood, there may be some other conditions that
We might have to
come with that
decide.
floodwaters, but separate from that, if it's a fire and it can be rebuilt as it was, it's even possible that the structure could be altered at some point in that process and the use reestablished as well. So there's a whole section in there on nonconformities and
So you
goes
don't
through those
necessarily
rules.
have to keep the same footprint?
It depends. If you have a non-conforming, because you can have a non-conforming use and a non-conforming structure, or one or the other, so there are some different provisions that come into place, but the underlying principle is that you have the right to resume and reconstruct what you had before.
For some period of time.
Yes. And I can't cite the numbers off the top of my head, but I think once again you've got I think we've allowed extra time there because you obviously had to deal with the insurance companies. So I think we gave you, I can't
So
remember the
those are
numbers.
some of the nuances of
You can
really
keep
getting
extending
into
it.
the,
You can
Yeah.
get 3 10-month
you know.
extensions.
So I think it
This
ended
is
up being
where
up to
you get
3
in trouble.
years
Right.
to get
Well,
that
yeah, this is where
process underway.
they come involved.
Is that a change? I mean, the fire on Elliott Street at 214, there was a question of whether they would be allowed to rebuild. It was 6 units. And is the new ordinance more permissive, or is it just as permissive?
I think that we did extend the period of time that you get to take action because it has become increasingly apparent that getting through the insurance process takes more than a year. So we have extended that out, I think, to a 3-year sort of window
Right.
here. And I can't really speak to what your current process is, but I doubt that
This is
there's
more-
sort of an underlying statewide right that you have to rebuild what you had. The flood
I
regulations
assume not the
add
same.
another
Right.
set of issues, but
So I think, in particular, with the one on Elliott Street, I'm not entirely sure whether, I think it was 2 more units than would be permitted in that area. And so,
But they would have been allowed to rebuild if they...
within 3 years, under the
Yeah.
proposed regulations. And I'm not sure what period of time we allowed for under the existing regulations.
Do you think that time has extended or contracted?
We're gonna confirm that for you right now.
So it was 1 year. It says if any non-complying, if any non-complying structure is destroyed to an extent of more than 75% of its value, as appraised by the town, reconstruction shall be made only in accordance with this bylaw. So I think that was the issue on that it was.
So that wouldn't have allowed that building.
Right.
so this is
Right.
actually, the revision here would be more expansive both in terms of time and that's something that there's sort of a built-in, I don't know if there's a specific statutory reference or not, but it's an underlying principle in Vermont land use law that you do have that right. And that's one of the things we are doing with this revision is we're catching a few of those things that, given the age of your ordinance, haven't quite kept pace with case law
So
and
the
statute.
new regulations are more relaxed than the existing regulations in that specific regard.
But this is, a 6-unit building could not be built on Elliott Street now.
On that
I'd have to look at the
on
site
that-
and the,
No, I'm just curious, because when you talk about
On that segment.
changes in usage, and
I think
people are renting and buying much smaller units
So-
and having different family configurations. And
right, so we know, you would be allowed to have multifamily. Whether you could get 6 units or not would be dependent on the particular property.
Yes.
Because we would require 6,000 square feet per, the first 2 units I think would require 6,000 square feet, and then each additional unit would be 6,000 square feet. So we have,
of land area.
yeah,
Right.
sorry. It is a little bit, we're not allowing as dense of a development, but the trade-off there was we were finding some properties where had a lot of units in them and parking was becoming a problem, and where you're storing the trash, and then that impacted the neighborhood, so. We had a sliding scale before where we're not proposing a sliding scale.
balancing that with our need for more housing.
Right. So
How do you balance?
So it's.
Well, we made some choices about the level of neighborhood amenity and there are practical considerations of the provision of off-street and on-street parking. So in that area, off-street parking is available as well as on-street parking. Brattleboro doesn't have an even odd snow plowing system, so in a neighborhood as dense as Elliott Street, when in winter people have to find an off-street location for their auto, that impacts the landscaping as much as it does anything else, and stormwater management and a set of other issues. And so on balance, what we decided was a minor reduction in the density of units in a residential structure such as that, and the payoff is better treatment of the services, including storage of propane tanks, trash, recycling, and so forth. And then some amenity for the occupants of the building also, so that there's some landscaping and other qualities that would improve the character of the individual building and that parcel in a broader neighborhood context. So we weighed those things carefully. We don't think it's going to lead to a dramatic reduction in the number of housing units. We do think it over time could lead to a meaningful improvement in the quality of the residents' lives in housing, in structures that are better suited, better catering to their needs better.
So the draft residential neighborhood district has a 12 dwelling unit to the acre maximum density. So it isn't like the current, which it's a sliding scale. So the bigger that multi-unit building, the higher the density could be on the lot. Some of that is to try to encourage some smaller number of rental units. So trying to not create an incentive to take down several buildings and put up a larger multi-unit building. It kind of eliminates that incentive. You don't get any further with density by doing that. So trying to encourage, and we heard from people about liking owner-occupied rentals, 3-4 unit buildings rather than larger, 8+ type unit buildings in the residential neighborhood. It's trying to meet there in the middle of what is.
I think in that neighborhood in particular, we're actually trying to preserve and expand the owner-occupied and longer-term residential nature of the neighborhood, right? And so there's some subtle shifts in there that we're speaking to.
So, this bothers, well, it doesn't bother me a little bit, it's the nature of our town, is that because we're such a residential town and we don't have a lot of expansion for single-family dwellings, that a lot of these buildings will be turned into apartments.
Well, I think this neighborhood is already dominated by
Yeah,
older homes that have been
Right.
converted into
That bothers me.
multi-dwelling units.
I mean, I would much rather see single-family dwellings.
I think there was an interesting program on NHPR Exchange today talking about rental and the changing dynamics of the family and how millennials are looking actually for the rental units. So it might just be the market. It's going to bear that out eventually.
Right.
I think, John, also, we talked sometime about wanting to attract younger people, or
Yeah.
I think, depending on someone's finances, it's easier to rent a studio or a small unit.
Oh, I
And
do,
so
but
that
I
might
just don't
be-
wanna see us becoming so, out of balance. A rental units as opposed to single-family housing, because our grand list is
We
based on.
already
We already
We
pretty
already
out
are,
of
but-
balance.
well,
I know we're out of balance, and I just
compared to
don't,
national
and I
trends,
don't
yeah.
wanna
Yeah.
see that getting worse,
Right.
because we are out of balance, and because that single-family home pays a good chunk of what happens to our grand list in town. And the more apartments you get.
To be really clear, the neighborhood that we're talking about, I think already has had, and for a long period of time has had.
Yeah. Oh, no, I agree with that, that neighborhood, yes.
Right.
Yes,
So-
but I'm saying in general, just around
Right, and-
Brattleboro.
We're making sure that there's appropriate
Right.
levels of, responses to different markets and different needs, or different
Yeah.
household forms of household
Yeah.
types, I guess,
Yeah.
is the other way of saying it. So,
Peter?
Yeah, I just want to add to that.
in the residential neighborhood zone, there are more intense multifamily,
Restrictions?
what's the word, the density that was allowed under the old than what's being proposed under the new. So, you know, as it's true throughout the state, the accessory use is there, but in order to go to especially the 3, 4, 5 and more units in an individual dwelling, that's actually not allowed anymore. So there is that protection in the mixed use area. That's going to be more development of multifamily, but there shouldn't be more development of multifamily in the residential neighborhood district.
Donna, I do agree with you. You know, that's to get people in, we have to make it affordable, you know, but there's still a lot of people that would like to own their own home.
All right.
That's, I think what we were just talking about is that's really a changing demographic, that people they don't want that anymore. The younger people don't want that anymore. And it may be that trend towards more rental is not necessarily, you know, we're looking at it in terms of what used to be, but maybe we're not out of touch. Maybe we're right where we ought to be in terms of what's happening demographically. Or out of sync or whatever the word is.
All right, so the
We might
nature
be
of this
ahead of the
discussion
curve.
has led me to conclude that this was exactly the right topic to put on the agenda. Thank you so much for presenting on it. We do have a whole additional topic to talk about tonight, and so I don't want to cut this off because it's been a very useful discussion, but if we can start moving this part of the discussion towards conclusion, so then we can talk about the things that Brandy came for specifically, if that's okay with everybody.
Oh, that's fine, yeah, I didn't know we had this.
No, this has been great. Yeah.
That's
I know, I would.
It is where we are, but we're not into what Brandy came for yet, so.
So this is just another part of the mixed use, that big blob that you were asking about, David. This is another part of it, Bird Street, Flat Street. And I think significant here probably is that you're looking at the Brattleboro Kiln on Flat Street. And that, you know, has some industrial use now that under the mixed use would not be allowed any longer, so.
But to emphasize, it's grandfathered in, and so as long as its use continues, it's a viable use.
And I just wanted to show this picture here, this is right across the street from it, so the context of it is that it does sit in a residential neighborhood. Obviously, it's a legacy use as well. This used to be the industrial area of town, but now it's, there's a lot of multifamily residential there. And so our thought there was, you know, let's mitigate the impacts of industrial uses on the neighborhoods. David just left, and
Well, we skip
was-
this for now.
okay, we'll go
And
forward.
to the, so what's left afterwards
Okay.
is the
We'll go back to that.
institutional, right?
I actually didn't go into the industrial, I didn't do any slides on the institutional because they're pretty much the PUDs and it's kind of all individual. This is the industrial district, this is Cotton Mill Hill, and then some of Route 142. These had been in a commercial industrial district, but now they would go into the industrial district. These are images of some of what's on 142 and Cotton Mill Hill. So these are uses that would no longer be allowed, residential uses, lodging, shopping centers, banks, again, some of the retail, restaurants, movie theaters, fitness clubs, that kind of thing, so.
Oh, Robin.
I'm sorry,
That's okay.
I'm doing my best to pay attention to what's going on, but.
Robin Sweetapple. The only thing about the industrial that I noticed, and we weren't talking about that in our working group, was that banks, or not banks so much, but credit unions usually sort of congregate around an industrial use because they were formed for those workers. So like the book press, members first started actually right inside the book press building. So I was wondering if that would be something that maybe we could consider making conditional, especially for the credit unions, only because of the nature of that business and the workers that it still caters to. And then the other was, just happened to notice that of the health clubs that are around, the ones are actually in those industrial buildings. So if that could be also made a conditional use, just so that, it seems like, because of the way the flooring is, it's just more conducive to that kind of higher ceiling, so for the weights dropping, I mean, not so great for me, but, or not used to be so great for me, but great at the root press or at Supreme Fitness, where they have more of a chance not to die from a weight falling on them. But anyway, those are just two things I wanted to mention.
Or through the floor.
Exactly.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
Your office is
I just wanted to point out this area too. This is exit 1 and Paul's Road here. This is the Delta campus. The highlighted in yellow is currently rural residential, and we're proposing that it go to industrial. There are some residential houses along Paul's Road in Brattleboro. We spoke to one of the property owners who is quite impacted by truck traffic from Commonwealth Dairy. We had talked about this at one of the other meetings, but I wanted to point out these areas. This site that abuts 91 is not currently developed, but I think it often comes into consideration in economic development discussions. Not easily developable or inaccessible right now, but I'll talk about these waterfront areas. This is Route 30. This is the town playing fields, West River Park, and then there's the professional office. There's Green Mountain Power has a station here, and then there's Fulcrum Arts and Saxon's River Distillery in this building. This is currently zoned commercial office. We're proposing that it be in the waterfront district because it is adjacent to the West River. There's the potential for some nice views, maybe access, maybe some sort of development oriented towards the river there. This new uses for this commercial, what's currently commercial office, would be hotel, motel, warehousing and storage, beverage manufacturing, miscellaneous manufacturing. In the definition, it gets into kind of artisanal production. So it's kind of uses that are already there. And then obviously the office uses, there's residential that would be allowed as well, all of which are allowed under the existing zoning. This Springtree Road, we're also proposing that it would be in the waterfront district. And there's about 4 zoning districts in here right now. So this is an upper plateau that sits beneath New Chapter. This is currently zoned West River Residential. And then this cornfield that's right here is zoned industrial. And then there's a part of it that's zoned West River Waterfront that comes all the way out to Putney Road. And then there's some rural residential down on the low-lying lands adjacent to the West River. What I tried to do with this table is tell you where kind of illustrate where some of the changes are. So this cornfield that's in the industrial zoning district, obviously all these industrial type junkyards, construction, heavy industry, those kind of uses would no longer be allowed there. For the West River waterfront, which is more in this area, the checked districts, or the checked uses would no longer be allowed. So those would be changes. For the West River residential, none of these are allowed there, so there's no, it's residential uses now, those could continue under waterfront.
Are any of those things, besides being the cornfield, the West River waterfront, are any of those things that are no longer allowed to be used? Are they there? I just can't tell where you are.
Are they there?
Yeah, but what isn't like the roller drome, is that in that
Light
section
industry,
or not?
could that be a problem with this?
No, the roller drome is
That's in the
neighborhood
other
center.
district.
Yeah, Roller is neighborhood center, so it's further along the road. There's currently, there's a solar installation
Right.
company, and
By
I,
the Quonset hut there, right?
and I think that's,
We'd have to
That's
check on that and the
But
definition.
the rest, beyond that, it's nothing.
Okay.
Is the correction, is the school?
And then the school is in neighborhood, I understand the school's in neighborhood center because it's immediately behind the pink,
Okay,
that's
yeah,
the pink building.
okay, so that's fine.
The big
You
pink,
mean
the big pink building.
DOC school.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yes.
I was gonna say, what school are you talking about?
Department
The
of
media broadcast
yes.
facility, the radio station, is
Right.
the radio station?
Yes, the radio
there?
station's still there.
So the media broadcast facility would be a problem.
I thought that was in the rollerdrome,
It is in the roller drum.
but I thought the rollerdrome was in the.
Yes,
And the roller
Sorry.
drum is the neighborhood center.
yeah.
And so,
Oh, so would it be allowed because it's a neighborhood center, not because it's a?
no, I think it's allowed in neighborhood center.
Oh,
Let me,
that's-
let me check.
Oh, okay.
It is permitted in the neighborhood center. so-
Yes, the radio station, it's okay, Tim gets to stay, it's all right.
I'm just gonna stop talking.
Yeah, Tim, yeah, the radio station's fine.
All right,
Because
so
the roads
Dave's
are-
back, so we can talk a little bit more about the
Yeah,
waterfront
okay.
over on Western Ave.
So I wanted to talk about the waterfront on Western Ave. So it actually stretches all the way down kind of William Street. It's a lot of kind of open spaces. It's a lot of the back ends of residential parcels that kind of come up here. And then there's the Route 9, which is farmers market properties and some other private properties. This is, all of these are currently zoned in some form of residential zoning district. So this actually would open up a whole host of uses, commercial, non-residential uses that aren't currently allowed. So lodging uses, commercial, public assembly, museums, galleries, all these kind of uses that you see here. So there'd be a wide variety of uses, expansion. The waterfront zoning district doesn't allow gas stations, but neither does the underlying
Unless we put it in
residential.
really
So,
fast.
well, it's
No.
not allowed in the existing zoning either,
It's-
so,
It's a legacy use that predates the existing zoning.
No waste time.
yeah, okay. So,
Well, they're all gone at exit 2 anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
Yes, I mean, which is, gets back to Donna's question, you know,
Right.
if you actually start mapping things out like that over a long period of time, there's been a marked reduction in the number of gas stations over the last, even just 4 or 5 years, associated with other broader trends and.
Okay.
All right.
So now we're gonna
yeah,
turn it over to Brandy.
Great, so let's be clear. Is there any other questions about this uses discussion? From anybody at the table or anybody who's in attendance? Does anybody need a break?
No, I just.
Does BCTV need a break? No, she says. Okay,
It wants to go.
ready?
Okay.
Okay, so I want to address some of the questions and issues that I have been made aware that you guys have brought up and asked at prior meetings. Sort of going to begin here just talking a little bit about the context of Brattleboro's regulations that are being proposed and how they fit in with what other communities in Vermont, around the country, are doing. You know, I think you said, David, you're in the mainstream or not, you are in the mainstream of sort of contemporary best practices of planning and zoning. You know, we have evolved the zoning tools over time. You know, we talked about the Euclidean zoning as sort of the starting point, the basic foundation. You might want to think of it as mid-century modern zoning because that is its era. And I guess that's really popular right now, so maybe we need to go back to it. But you know, that still is the foundation of zoning. But there were a lot of problems with that idea of just strictly separating uses, having, you know, this is where we put single-family homes, this is where we put multi-family homes, this is where we put retail, this is where we put offices, this is where we put schools, and we put factories. And to get for all these places you have to go every day, you have to drive them all around in a big circle every day. So, you know, it wasn't too long before there started to be some recognized challenges with this approach, and various other zoning tools began to be used by municipalities around the country to address some of those limitations that had become obvious for sort of your basic Euclidean zone. This zone is for this, and that zone is for that. The first of these performance type standards, this is a way to sort of allow that mix of uses, but say, okay, we know that some of these uses could impact the others, so we're going to control those impacts. That might be noise and light, it might be traffic, it might be generation of stormwater, changing the sort of natural landscape, the need for buffering, aesthetic concerns. There's all sorts of different types of performance standards that municipalities put in. By the time we get around to the 1980s or so, most zoning codes are starting to incorporate some of those types of performance standards into their zoning. Your current zoning has some of that type of language in it, and certainly that's something that the draft continues to include. As we sort of continued to evolve, there became, this idea of market-based things. Market-based approaches to everything became popular at some point. And so the idea was trying to create incentives. We're not just making sticks to hit people with here. We want to include some carrots to try to get to the kind of development we want. In Vermont, you see this come out mostly in the 90s through planned unit developments, planned residential developments, trying to put those types of systems in place that provide flexibility, provide bonuses for achieving certain community goals. The draft does contain some elements of that, just like your current zoning has a very kind of an original form of planned unit development. And in fact, I think it may be unique. If you want something that's unique amongst Vermont communities, your existing approach to planned unit development is, and it's because it's a much, much older model that was before most municipalities in Vermont got into doing planned unit developments. And so the approach that most communities take is quite different. It's not really that rezoning approach, which is how you've been doing it over the years. So the draft has sort of different types of planned unit developments. This is sort of a next evolution of the concept. Probably initially most Vermont regulations had one or two different types, a residential type, maybe a rural residential one, conservation subdivision type of use, maybe something that was a little more village, mixed use oriented type of planned unit development. So that piece is there. And as we continue to go forward, these tools are helping. We're getting a lot closer to getting to the type of development we want. But if you go to any sort of development review hearing, the issue that's always on the table that people are concerned about is, what is this going to look like? What is this development? What is this project going to look like? And most zoning ordinances speak very little, at least until like the last 10 years. They said very little about what this is going to look like, which is probably the top issue that people are concerned about. And so to address those issues, that the idea of form-based codes came, and it came out of the architectural community. So it's very, it is a different, takes a different stance and approach to zoning, thinking very much about the physical design of buildings primarily, and secondarily for how they sit and relate to streets and frame and create public spaces. These codes have been started to be adapted around the country. Very few places are doing a pure form-based code. You mostly see them in some places where there's vast and rapid growth, and they're creating an entirely new town. Burlington, for instance, is moving to do more form-based codes. They're right in the process of actually adopting their downtown and waterfront form-based code. It's probably one of the more complete form-based codes that any of the Vermont municipalities have implemented to this point, and it still has a use table and has a conditional use review process. It's the Vermont way, and it's also the way when you have a developed community. People are going to want to have a voice. They're going to want to be heard. They're not going to be happy with development that's simply going to be reviewed through an administrative process, which is what the pure sort of form-based code approach is, that we sort of write the rules so specifically that we know the exact outcome. It's all black and white. There doesn't need to be this discretionary process. There doesn't need to be this community input and conversation. So I think that sort of full 100% implementation of form-based code is unlikely to be used in Vermont and in communities that are already developed, primarily used for an area or an entire municipality that's sort of being created, or a specific sort of area where a whole new development is going to occur. We'll go with that approach. I did put up here on the screen a list of some of the more recent sort of complete zoning overhauls. These communities in Vermont have all done overhauls in the last 10 years-ish. They have slightly different emphasis about which tools they are using most heavily. All of them have most of these types, some combination of these tools to some extent. Slightly different ways of implementing it. We have in the draft, the things like the lighting and landscaping standards that are in this draft are very similar to the lighting and landscaping standards that Williston's been using since, I don't know exactly when they adopted, because Williston adopted their zoning incrementally, not necessarily a recommended practice between 2004 and 2009. So at some point during that process, those landscaping and lighting standards went into play, and things are still happening in Williston. Things are still being built there. Shelburne's zoning, once again, they're still also looking at some form-based code things, but they have a lot of planned unit development provisions in their code and their zoning, and a lot of incentive-based systems, so that's the tool that they've relied on most. I think Morristown is kind of an interesting comparison. They did a great consolidation in the mid-2000s. They combined the town and village zoning and subdivision, so they basically combined 4 sets of regulations into one and went to one board. Streamlining their review process was a major consideration, which I think is one of the concerns that has been raised here, is trying to look at process and procedure. I think Morristown is sort of a hands-off, free market kind of place, but even they recognize that particularly their commercial areas and their downtown areas, they wanted to have some specific guidance about the form and design of development, because there was a specific outcome that they wanted to see in those areas in terms of what development would look like and how it would function. And they have put sort of, not dissimilar to how this draft has district-specific standards, they have those types of standards for some of those districts, whereas in outlying areas it's a little more freewheeling. Bennington's another good comparison. Theirs is probably a little older. I think theirs goes back to the early 2000s. But they have a lot of design review elements in their regulations. And some of those dimensional standard ideas where, this draft has both minimum and maximum setbacks and heights and things like that. Those are tools that you'll see in the Bennington regulations as well. So I think in terms of just the range of the types of language that's in the regulations, it is fairly standard practice to combine these things. Certainly we are looking to make sure that we aren't creating gears that aren't meshing and bring everything to a stop, and that's some of the process we've been working through in the last few months of looking at projects and making adjustments and thinking about where there needs to be more flexibility and such. We looked at a lot of models in doing this, so you don't ever take a model whole cloth and just adopt it. Usually that's a route to problems for you down the road. But we did look, for instance, the stormwater. We reviewed a range of statewide models from around New England, and then that helped sort of shape the conversation about what direction to go with the stormwater. The lighting comes from the International Dark Skies Association's recommendations, and we worked off of those. So we definitely did a fair amount of research. The very first draft of the regulations was heavily footnoted with notations about where some of the standards were coming from. So if you want to dig deep, you can go back to the very first working draft, which I think we've still got hanging around somewhere in PDF form, so you can move that ahead, I think. So I know there were some questions at one of the previous meetings about the dimensional standards and what the different purposes of them are and how they're meant to work together. You do see that in the districts they use a variety of dimensional standards. Not all the districts use the exact same mix. And these are really intended to sort of mold and shape future development. If you think of the first set of basic standards sort of create a 3D box, but then as we start adding more of these dimensional standards, we're really starting to shape that box a little more precisely to get to the type issues of context and scale and design and character. And, you know, the standards do serve different purposes. They have to work together to some degree, but they are not necessarily designed so that every applicant can maximize every single one of these standards on every lot. In various situations, different elements of these dimensional standards will become a limiting factor on different lots. It depends on the lot, the size of it, the shape of it, whether there are, you know, natural features on it that are constrained to begin with. So, you know, if you look at the math simply, you're like, oh, wow, you know, the maximum footprint may be smaller than, or maybe larger than the minimum
Right.
lot size, but it's not intended that, you know, on the minimum lot size, you can build the maximum size building. You know, they're not, the math isn't quite supposed to work like that. So, how they work together to really just do different things. So, well, yeah, stick with this one for just a minute. So I just want to, I'm just going to touch on these briefly. Like the minimum side and rear setbacks, their real purpose is to establish separation distances between buildings on adjacent lots. They're not really as well geared at controlling the scale and location of development within the lot. They're a lot more about separation and yard space, how much yard there's going to have to be at a minimum. The minimum and maximum front setback, by having both of those, we're basically establishing this regular building pattern, which if you go to the older neighborhoods, it clearly exists. If you go to some of the areas that have been built out under current zoning, you know, or zoning back in the 80s and things like that, you see a lot more variability into where those buildings are situated on the road. So in the areas where we are trying to get to a specific sort of character, the village center areas, the urban center, the neighborhood centers, we're trying to create a pedestrian-oriented street frontage. Controlling where that building sits in relation to the road is an important element of that, so that's the reason for both that minimum and maximum setback, and they work together that way. Height is sort of the same thing. There's some basic reasons why there are minimum or there are maximum height requirements. You know, you got to be able to get the fire truck to serve the top floor of your building, and so there's currently a maximum in Brattleboro 60 feet, and we're carrying that forward because that's a basic public safety requirement. But this idea of the minimum, bringing the minimum height requirement in with that, goes back to that idea of defining the street frontage, defining a certain character. There are places where you do want the building to have a little more presence on the road, and height helps that. So between the height and the setback, you're really creating this defining box around the street, which is one of the things that form-based code is looking at, is to think about what you're doing on that cross-section of the street. So the lot coverage piece, this is someplace where the draft has probably made a more significant change from current practice in several places, particularly the more commercial districts, by lowering this lot coverage, and it goes back to stormwater. Allowing for reducing how much lot coverage, impervious lot coverage there can be, allows for on-site wastewater management, allows for better infiltration, filtration, flows, how quickly water is getting from parking lots to the river to your downtown. You know, there's a real focus in the regulations on all things water, and that goes back to the sustainability ideas that Rod mentioned before as being very critical. So lot coverage, that green space, that's really the primary reason for lowering that. There's also some aesthetic improvements that you get from having more green space for landscaping, but the stormwater is one of the major driving factors there. And then the floor area ratio is once again about compatibility of scale within the district, and just making sure that, you know, buildings are going to be appropriately scaled for their setting. And I did actually look, since I was pulling information about some of those other zoning things, Burlington's zoning has floor area ratios, so I looked at theirs today, and actually the ranges are not significantly different from where the floor area ratios in here are falling. They went from 5.5 on Church Street in downtown Burlington to about 0.75, I think, in the Intervale agricultural industrial area, and I think you'll see that in the developed districts there's sort of that type of range from 1 to 5, range is kind of the same range we're in the draft, so. A few districts also have a maximum building footprint, and this, it gets more precisely at that character. And so the districts that this has been included in are I think the village center, the neighborhood center, are the two that, and maybe the residential as well.
I think rural business,
Yeah.
and quite a few of the mixed use
The
ones.
mixed use ones. And this is really because the character, you know, in these areas is quite important. The floor area ratio, the setbacks, the lot coverage, they all are proportional to lot size. So as the lot size gets bigger, development on that lot can get bigger. This maximum footprint sets a ceiling and says this is sort of what's in character for the area. You know, the village center area in West Brattleboro, do you want a 50,000 square foot building even if the lot is big enough to meet all those other standards? You know, there probably isn't any other building there that's more than a few thousand square feet. It would be completely different in character. So that's what that provision is really meant at, where there's a real sort of specific scale and character you want to keep. This creates a ceiling that no matter what is going on with the land, you know you're going to have that protection. So you can shift this one forward. I sort of hit on this a little bit with my opening remarks, but I think this image sort of helps differentiate how we sort of go from the top. Those are your basic mid-century modern Euclidean zoning standards of we set a building height, we set setbacks, and that's it. If we start to look at some standards maybe about what's going on around the facade, some dimensional standards for heights, minimums, maximums, and breaking up the massing of the building, you could get something like what's in the middle, where you're treating the facade, but maybe the mass is sort of the same, but you're just sort of changing the appearance of that mass. Getting to regulations that look at the footprints and the placements of the buildings in relation to the streets, you're getting more towards that third image where you're really refining how much you are controlling what the ultimate shape of and form of the development is going to be that comes out of it. So sustainability is a basic theme that runs through the town plan, which is the guiding policy document for the regulations. And as Rod said, the principles of sustainability are starting to find their way from planning documents into regulatory documents. There's been a recent study released, that sort of a way to look at how sustainable your zoning codes are and doing. Burlington was used in this national study as a point of comparison and turned out to be one of the most sustainable codes that was ranked in this assessment. But I think the principles that they laid out actually align very well with what you're doing with Brattleboro's regulations. They align with the things that the plan is encouraging. These are very typical goals that municipalities around the country have. And this draft actually does very well. It's pretty much does equivalently well as Burlington's code does on these principles at trying to get at these sustainability ideas, focusing the higher density, encouraging more mixed uses, looking at transportation alternatives. Those are all, as Sue was going over the districts, those are all goals that are underlying those districts. And then the last thing I was going to hit on, because I heard there were some questions about sort of the economics and aesthetics, what are the pros and cons of sort of raising the bar in terms of landscaping and building design. There is a really fairly extensive body of research out there on the impacts of design and landscaping on the value of commercial properties. I think we've all heard of the studies that say that if you live on a street that has trees, your house is worth more than if you live on a street that doesn't have trees. There's been equivalent sort of studies done of commercial properties and real estate values. And, they do show demonstrable benefits to the property owner and to the municipality. Rents can be higher in office buildings that have aesthetically pleasing landscaping and shaded buildings. Particularly with regards to retail, there's been a lot of studies of where people prefer to shop, dine, and people will stay longer in a pleasant environment. That doesn't probably take rocket scientists to prove, but you know, that, I guess maybe the fact that those malls always had trees inside them was a clue. People do like not really happy looking trees, but trees nonetheless. People will stay longer, they will, you know, they stay longer, you know, the retailers want people to stay longer to spend more money. Studies have shown that people are willing to pay more, you know, marginally more to shop in an area that's more pleasant than they could at some place that is a less pleasant experience. And people are more likely to come back to and make return trips to those places. And just like, you know, the negative spillover effects that come from blighted properties, the positive spillover effects from aesthetic enhancements benefit the neighborhoods too, more broadly. So, you know, I think some of it's pretty obvious that, you know, higher quality construction, higher quality site design contributes more to the tax base, it creates higher value. And then some of them are a little less obvious, but if you think through them, you know, Rod spoke to the sort of phases of retail development and commercial growth on Putney Road. And there's a real sort of difference in building construction over time. And a lot of those buildings that got built sort of in the 60s, 70s, particularly in the 80s, the quality of construction and their sort of single-use buildings, they are not as easily adaptable over time to other things. They were not meant to last for decades and decades and decades, maybe a couple decades, but not 50 years. And so that goes back to the sustainability ideas of trying to, you know, make sure that what you're building today doesn't necessarily have to be rebuilt in 20 years. Trying to encourage an energy efficiency and use of resources efficiently and using, you know, durable materials and things like that. Those are all interlinked elements. And then the green space and landscaping, I think Sue mentioned this earlier, that really the idea is that that space should be serving multiple functions. It should be an aesthetic enhancement. It should be green stormwater infrastructure. It can be helping be buffer sound abatement for surrounding uses. It can be energy conservation, you know, whether it's shading in the summer, windbreaks, things like that. It may, in some places, you know, leave a vegetated riparian corridor. It may be doing filtering and cleaning functions. There may also be wildlife benefits that come with that. So this landscaping and green space, it's not just pretty, I guess. It really is serving a lot of other functions, and pretty's good too. You know, it helps. So, you know, a lot of your gateway ideas about improving the two highway corridors really were about beautifying those corridors. So, those elements all can work together with a bit of enhanced green space and landscaping. That's sort of, yes. So I brought in some pictures, a little inspiration photo montage of different ways that landscaping can be integrated in to the built environment, and, you know, creatively with a mix of plants and different approaches. So, you know, you can be screening parking, you can be doing stormwater, you can be creating pleasant sort of urban environments where people want to sit and shop and walk. And my favorite one down there in the corner is sort of this repurposed old vintage gas station. The new life for the service station. It might be the theme of tonight's meeting. But once again, sort of taking, you know, an area that, whether this is a repurposed building or it is an auto-oriented use, there can be green space integrated in to really enhance the character of the site. And in terms of building design, I brought a few ideas here that some of the things that the standards are trying to get at. Up in the top left corner there, threw this one in. This is actually a new Dunkin' Donuts that's been built in Malta, New York, which, interestingly enough, adopted a form-based code that required it be 2 stories, and so it is, and it has office space upstairs. You know, so even with the idea of franchise architecture, there are ways to make that fit in with the standards and work for both. I included the picture of the Best Buy for sort of the same reasons, that's sort of it certainly still has its corporate identity. You're not going to mistake that building for anything other than the Best Buy store, but it has responded to its setting a bit by the color palette and the material choices. So sort of meet partway, I guess, between sort of entirely unique design for a municipality, for a particular place versus their corporate or franchise design.
I want my office above a Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah, I think that would be dangerous.
My next office.
Yeah. But up in the upper right-hand corner, does anyone want to guess what that is?
Hospital.
A Dunkin' Donuts.
It's almost a Dunkin' Donuts. It is a gas station with convenience store, believe it or not. The pumps are in the back. Can you see?
Oh yeah, you can see the
You see the canopy?
canopy.
Yep. And
Wow.
it's got office space
You
in
can
the
see the
upper.
mobile.
That's not anywhere around here.
It's
a mobile
actually
station.
in Ohio somewhere, and I'm sorry that the only photo I have of it is this right. Some of us go around places and take pictures of gas stations. We are weird. Us planners. It has, the convenience store in it, and it has a pizza shop in it, and it still is a functional gas station as well. So I think it's good to point out that those types of uses can be accommodated within a form that could fit in your village center areas very nicely, or neighborhood center areas. The little wine shop, I particularly like that building. It has a lot of the nice display and character, the little canopies and such, the signage that are being encouraged in the design standards in a lot of the districts. A little public sitting space and such in front. And then in the lower right-hand corner, that's the Shelburne Green Business Park, which I think is a nice way to sort of break up. There's actually a massive warehouse in the center of that. The bit of the red that you're seeing in that photo is the sort of massive warehouse portion, but they put two sides on that sort of have smaller breakout building facades that sort of break up the mass of that big building. It's still a very functional and desirable light industrial site, but it's slightly visible from Route 7. It has a nice appeal visually. So, plus eating well is there. So, it's a nice spot. So those are my slides. So I hope those address some of the questions that you had. Anything else to
Thank
throw
you
at
very
me?
much. I'm not sure, does anybody have any questions at this point based upon what Brandon just presented? So, core purpose that we had following Adam's comments 3 weeks ago was to hear from people who apparently have some concerns about the draft ordinance, and also to hear from, Brandy responding to what Adam had presented to us at our last meeting. So it's really an opportunity. It's not the last opportunity, because obviously Planning Commission is going to be meeting again in anticipation of presenting the zoning ordinance back to Select Board. But we had heard that there were people in the development community who were planning to approach first the Planning Commission, and given that we've been having this discussion here, we thought we would invite people from the development community, if there are any concerns, to raise them now with the Select Board before we go back to Planning Commission, and to raise them in this context where we've got both the Planning Department people and the consultant with us. So I see there's 4 of you here. Elizabeth is in the back, and anybody's got anything to say, we're all ears.
Just one other.
Yeah.
Can you kind of go over what the process is from this point in terms of getting this accepted?
I defer to
Will there
Mr.
be
Francis,
more-
please.
I think there are going to be more public hearings and more
Yes.
public presentations. coming
So
up.
we're still
Just
in.
what's the schedule for completing this?
I don't have a schedule. That's something that we will solidify, hopefully even at the end of this meeting and moving forward. So we are coming to the close of a special informal review process where the Planning Commission and staff have brought the draft.
Primer for the school board. Or the select board, right?
Get your
We're
board
happy,
ready.
we're happy to present it to the school board, but I'm not sure if they're gonna be that
Approve it.
attentive. So, the idea here is that when we finish this evening, we'll have a clearer sense of, the path forward. We are hoping to schedule at least 2 public hearings for the planning commission, and at this point, we are looking at August, and then
Probably
the-
towards the
towards the end of August. And so our expectation is that we would still really like for the select board to hold its public hearings and make a decision before you move into deliberation on the budget. So we're hoping that that can still be achieved in the September to early October timeframe.
No, you said the select board will hold public hearings as well?
Yes,
Okay.
and you're required to
Just the
hold,
two.
Yes.
I believe,
Two.
Well, how many?
2,
So 2 with the planning commission still, and 2 with the select board?
yes.
Yeah.
They could be
It could be close together.
They can be close together in time, and they don't have to be standard meeting days. So in other words, if your effort is to try and have more time to discuss it, you might select a Saturday morning or a particular time of day or a day of the week that you think is likely to garner more interest from the public. The warning periods are set in statute, and
Right.
they are relatively long.
No, they're 15 days.
Yeah.
Right, so, those are the only restrictions on when to do it. And in the intervening period, we hope to have a series of articles presented in the newspaper that basically summarize the presentations that we've given to you.
And in both papers and Brattleboro as well?
Well, I can't speak, we have an undertaking from the reformer that they're interested in running a series of articles. But I can't speak, I mean, we can provide information to Brattleboro and the Commons as needed, or as they request it.
The 2 planning commission public hearings have to come before the 2 select board public hearings?
Yes.
Yes.
Alright.
And lastly, on this point, in the sort of formal sense, at the end of the 2 public hearings from the planning commission votes to move the draft document forward to the select board. And it's, you know, that version of the document is the one that you will consider. It may be different in important respects to the one that you've reviewed tonight, but we would of course make that obvious.
Yep.
Then if you choose to dramatically amend the land use regulations, you can do it as part of the hearing. You know, you can close the hearing and make those changes, or you can send it back to the planning commission for further consideration.
Hopefully by the second,
Bridget, question.
hopefully by the second public meeting that we have, everything should be vetted by then, we would hope.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what we've been really striving to do here is to make sure that you're pretty
Right.
familiar with the overall concept and actually comfortable with the contents, and that we are open to public comment and being responsive to that.
Right.
But at least the second public hearing of the select board should be a
Yeah.
matter of polishing the
Mhm.
final draft. That's our hope, I'd say.
Anything else from the board at this point? So Bob's standing in the microphone, but Monroe, if it's a procedural question,
This
right,
is,
you have to talk to the mic to be heard on the TV.
the question is, as soon as this is warned for the first public hearing with the planning commission, the town is actually working under this document. Is that not the case?
No,
That's
it's,
not the case.
it's not until the select board warns their hearing,
The select board
then
warns.
we are. It's reviewed under the proposal, and, you know, if an application got denied and then they never got implemented, then you'd go back and review it under the.
Okay, I just wanted to make it clear the importance of the scheduling of the
Yep.
public hearing and when it comes, when this document actually
Yes.
comes into
Becomes
effect.
policy, right?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons to make sure that by the time it gets to
Right.
you, that you are, it is polished, and you want to minimize that time frame, because your zoning administrator will be unhappy at trying to implement 2 sets of regulations at once.
He's usually unhappy anyways.
It comes to the territory.
As some applicants may be as well, so
Right.
it's really a good idea to try to minimize that time frame.
All right then, Bob.
Right. Thanks. Bob Stevens. Does everybody know who, let me back up, give a little background. I think in April, we had a presentation from the planning planning commission on the ordinance. And so we got a briefing as well as what the draft ordinance is. Since April, we sort of formed a small group to try to go through the proposed ordinance and relate that to our experience in trying to build projects, sort of understand case studies and give them some constructive feedback. So the people that have been working on it, I don't know if everybody knows, Peter Bomeg, Robin Monroe, Craig's been, Miscavige has been with us. Essentially, I think the four of us at the design community in this here for the last 30 years, so it's a fair amount of history in doing projects through town, and we've got many things on the books that we can sort of speak to, and most of us have served in one way or the other on the planning commission at the DRB over the years. But I just wanted to give a little background so you know who we are if you didn't know already. I want to also say that we have not yet met with the planning commission. We're meeting with them next week, so I feel a little bit out of school of sort of saying, well, here's our concerns. Because I think, let me just say that they've done a tremendous amount of work, and this ordinance really did need to get redone. And there's a lot of, I think, very appropriate and good things that are coming with this. It's also very complex, and so you're going to find our comments are saying, well, here's some things we think should be changed. There's really a lot in that we think are good. And there's a lot of sort of details that we have concerns about that are really sort of fine details that I don't think warrant sort of bringing to this board here tonight. We're going to meet with them next week. We've already shared a land use map with some comments, a use chart with some comments. We've got some sort of comments on lighting and landscaping and stormwater, all the sort of technical aspects that could be tweaked one way or another, but I don't think that they really rise to the issue of policy decisions. There's a couple of things that, because we were invited, that we will share with the Planning Commission next week, we thought we would share with you as well, that I do think people should start thinking about, and obviously the Planning Commission can have our comments and see what they think about it as well. We are concerned that the change to the PUD has removed a lot of flexibility in terms of changes of use. Actually, a number of things about the PUD that either concern us or we're not sure are going to be good for the town long term. So currently under our PUD ordinance, and in many cases over the years, we've had circumstances where we actually will look at an isolated property and come in through the zoning amendment. And nobody likes the zoning amendment process. Believe me, that was a long process. We kept saying, we should fix this, change this. Well, it got fixed, but it also took out one of the pieces of flexibility that we're now concerned about, which is the ability to have the community reconsider the uses of a particular lot. And this has come up, historically, if you think of Grafton Cheese, if you think of Delta Business Campus, Vermont Business, VBEC, all of these are properties that were not in a zoning district that would allow what ultimately was allowed after a large community planning process. So this ordinance has some very good residential PUDs and one sort of commercial PUDs that I think are sort of a good start, but it has dropped out this flexibility of use change, which I think is a concern to us in terms of what that means for the future. And I bring that up in the context of Austin. We have 100,000 square feet of buildings sitting up on the hill. So if you, in the conventional sense, we're going to pick a zone to put that in, I don't know what that is. Maybe, I think last time I saw it was institutional, and there's a lot of schools. Maybe it'll stay that way, but I don't think there's going to be 100,000 square feet of schools up there going forward. So what do you do with that? Are offices allowed, or are some kind of artisan? What is that? And because that property sits somewhat isolated into its own sort of campus, we have been successful in this community of looking at those, planning in more detail with those, and coming up with things that are sort of acceptable in the long run. And I think that's been successful, so I'm not sure that we want to give that up. The statute allows us to do that. This ordinance, this draft, would not allow us to do that. The second thing about the PUDs is that it is a little confusing, and this could just be a clarification as to what happens with the existing PUDs. We have a ton of them in this town. I think they're grandfathered in. It's not explicit. I think they are. Some of them have master plans. The hospital, as an example, there's a master plan. It's a PUD. It's now an institutional zone, and there's requirements under that. But for instance, there are 3 zones in the PUD for the hospital. One is a zone that's not developable along Maple Street and Canal. There's a zone in the core campus that allows sort of campus scale buildings, and then there's a zone out by the residential streets that allows buildings in more residential scale. That's a fine-grained sort of zoning application that you're not gonna get with one zoning district, which is the way you do it at a grand scale. And I don't know what applies when this passes. So I think it needs to be clarified. So can the hospital come in and now build something that's consistent with the new zoning in the area that had been designated to not build, or what can you do with that? Because it's a little unclear. There's a lot of existing PUDs that aren't on the zoning map anymore. I'm sure that was intentional. I know that, you know, there needs to be some house cleaning. I don't think that's a bad thing, but it's a concern we have about what that means for these properties. It also, one of the other things that PUDs have done in the past is allowed multiple ownerships, which has gone away, or at least we don't find it in there. Maybe it's in there now. But Delta is a PUD that was created with lots to be owned by different people. That type of PUD doesn't seem to be described anymore, because we're now just describing four different types of PUDs that are in there. And then finally, on the PUD, those PUDs are limited to certain districts. So there's a traditional neighborhood design PUD, great concept. We've done a couple of them. It's limited to the residential district. Unfortunately, the residential district, as the current maps are, doesn't have any real expansion capability. We're pretty tight to what's already built out. So I don't think that's going to happen. You know, there is buffer areas around the residential district that are rural residential that can connect to municipal water and sewer, that have buildable land where you could do a T&D, but it's not allowed in that. So those kinds of things to sort of sort through, you know, why would we limit, again, if density and everything else being equal? And there's a conversation that perhaps people could disagree, that maybe that form of development isn't appropriate in a rural setting, but a cluster development is, or a cottage development is, so those two are allowed in rural residential. So anyway, I think we have some concerns about the whole PUD piece as it sits. Second sort of policy level issue, and I have to say that maybe this has been changed, and maybe I don't fully understand it, so maybe it's more of a conversation, but there is a section under the rural districts that limits yield to after you do what we call a resource analysis. So this is a good thing. You take a raw piece of land and you say, here's steep slopes, here's wetlands, here's other areas you don't want to build in. We take that out. We've always done that, and you build on what's buildable. Under the current ordinance, at least under conventional subdivisions, you take all that stuff out, and then you determine how many lots you can get by the remaining area. So it actually significantly can reduce the development density within the rural residential district. So I'll give you an example. I owned a piece of property in Guilford Street that we looked at. It was a 20-acre parcel. 11 was a flat field, the rest was wetlands. Under the analysis, under the proposed ordinance, as I understand it, I could have gotten 5 units out of that. Under the current, we would have just taken 20 divided by 2 units per acre. I could have gotten 10. Now you might say, what's in the public's interest? Again, there was a slide earlier about sustainability. We usually look to while maintaining the character, maximize the value of the return to the community when you consume land. You kind of want to get as many units as you can get out of them, because those 20 acres are going to be consumed forever once those lots are built. And the roadway that serves those are going to be only supported by the grand list of 5 units instead of 10. So if the character can maintain, usually you're trying to push towards getting densities higher rather than lower. I will say that if you go under the PUD standard, there are density bonuses. So under conventional subdivision, I'd get 5. Under the PUDs, you'd get back up to the original one. So maybe that's an incentive or disincentive, but it's a concern that I have. It's also very complicated. It's a fairly complicated thing to ask people to do, to go through this resource analysis and agree on what's left and then divide that by, and I don't know that the complexity is warranted for the rest. So the last comment on that as well, that and this is something we see consistently through zoning ordinances, there's also a slope limitation of 25%. I want to just, again, these are sort of the little needle things that get in there. 25% is a tough slope to deal with. You don't want to do that if you can afford to, but we build on 25% slopes all the time. You know, a mobile slope is a 33% slope. The east side of Main Street is probably all on more than a 25%. Anytime you have a walkout basement on a house, you're steeper than 25%. It's it's not a non-buildable thing. It is something you gotta build around, and we live in a hill country. So I'm very concerned about saying, anything over 25%, we're not gonna consider buildable. Often, we need to look at, we build on the edges of those. You got a flat area plateau and it drops off. We will typically put the buildings on the drop-off and with a walkout basement or a parking underneath, because that's just good use of land. We need those flat areas. If you have a 25% consistent slope, it's tough to put roads and get in and out, but it is done. And I think we want to be careful that we're not, again, creating details that are going to long-term affect viability and drain lifts. I don't think I think these are things, again, we're bringing up that I don't think are consistent with the purpose, as we're listening tonight. It's just sort of another set of eyes, perhaps looking at things that are not consistent with what they were trying to do. But it's the nature of a complex ordinance when you try to adopt something wholesale like this. There's going to be things, none of us can look at it all. We're trying to help and be constructive. But even no matter what happens, if we all love it when it gets passed, we're going to be back here in 2 years saying there's a few things here that need to be tweaked. And we're just trying to limit the number of those things by talking about it now. Those are sort of the big issues. I think there's a couple of things about restrictions. Currently, the DRB has the ability to waive dimensional standards. The waiver provisions are scaled back. Not sure that that's necessary to do. And there's some sort of issues around jurisdiction and non-conforming uses that probably just need to be clarified. But I think that the big issues that from our perspective, there's a bunch of technical stuff that we'll comment on, and I think the Planning Commission, a lot of it is engineering and landscape related, so we're trying to pass that on and get that feedback so they can consider that in the rewrite of the draft. But the PUD is probably the biggest sort of policy issue that again is at some point you got to make a choice. Do you want flexibility in this to be able to make a change? Personally, I would rather keep the flexibility and have the arduous process we have now to do the zoning change than to lose all of that. I think there's probably a middle ground where we could pick one more PUD and apply it more liberally over other zones that gave you maybe some higher bar when you want to do a change in use. But again, community has, where that's been applied, I think it's worked pretty well. I'll give you another example. I think this is true. The campus PUD is not applicable in the rural residential district. Campus PUDs are generally what happens when we have new schools and world learning. A case like that, Center for Living Democracy, which came and left, is another example of a PUD was created on an isolated piece of property out in a rural residential area. It was a little retreat. But when you start looking at zoning for rural, it's not residential, but the community looked at that isolated area as a campus. It looked at the impacts of driving in and out of that. It was a dirt road. It seemed to be okay. It existed for many years without impacts to the neighbors. It went through a high burden of review to build it. But I would hate to lose that flexibility to not be able to consider those opportunities in the future. Did I miss anything else?
Yeah, so one thing you missed was.
The microphone.
Hold on. Monroe, do you want to speak to it, or are we going to let Bob speak for the group? All right, so
What were you talking about?
they're
Residential,
conferring.
More land to, that we developed at an RN.
Oh, that's, on the map, Monroe's, and I think we did, and I have to say that there's a lot of work, and we are sort of behind in trying to communicate effectively, because, quite frankly, we've struggled to get through it, even meeting weekly since April. But we did draft a map, suggested changes to the proposed zoning map. What Monroe's getting at is that within when we looked at what was left for unbuildable land in the residential district, it really didn't seem to be much. And there are some areas, particularly in West Brattleboro, lots that we've done preliminary designs on where we have concept designs for numerous housing units that are adjacent to the residential district that we're suggesting to sort of move into that higher density area just so that there's some room to grow. There's no real demand for that at the moment, but if there ever was a demand, you kind of need to put them someplace and adjacent to other nodes of development and places where there's water and sewer and something like that. But that's sort of the details that we can talk to the Planning Commission.
Anybody on the board have any questions at this point while they confer?
No, it just seems like a lot of the questions are going to be answered at the, with the planning.
Yeah. we really haven't had the conversation with them. So I feel like, you know.
No,
we're sharing a little bit with you
it's
guys.
great to hear them,
But,
and it's,
you know, and we really, you know, as I said, they've done a lot of work, and we want to be constructive, and we'd love to be supportive of the change, because the change is needed.
I think we'd like to not have you come back in 2 years with
Yeah.
needing changes, find them now.
Yeah. Great.
You wanna, I will say that as a little advice to the select board,
Yeah.
that when you do a major overhaul, there's always edits
exactly.
that have to be made.
Yes.
So you should expect that.
Yeah.
And we should expect it in 2 years. You know, not saying that, but yeah.
It's
we'll get it.
inevitable
First time.
that, you know, with a document of this complexity, you start to run some projects where you're gonna find some places where you wanna make adjustments based on the experience. I mean, we have been the past couple of months running, just like they've been doing, running some projects through, and so the planning commission has already started to consider some tweaks, you know, what dates on that, the February draft or whatever that everyone is reviewing. You know, I think we have about 5 pages of changes that we've made so far from that process and from hearing from people, so that'll continue for the next, we gotta finish it sometime, gotta do that next month.
So Bob spoke, and each of the three of the remaining members of this group made like single comments over the course of the evening. Anything else that anybody else wants to present at this point? Feel free, please, that's why you're here. And we love hearing from you.
It was really nicely done. I mean, we were all sitting there very, you know, amazed at the work you did, Randy. I mean, I don't want you to think that we sat there going, no, no, no. I mean, most of it was really constructive, and we actually just, some of the questions we had are so particular, and I think that is indicative of a really decent job done. But I just wanted to make sure, because I know Bob and Monroe have both spoken to that, so just so that you hear it out loud and that we say it in front of the select board.
Rob?
We can knock off some really, you know, there's some simple answers, straightforward answers that we can already provide to some of Bob's questions if you. So
I'm happy to have the discussion now, because then they can
yeah.
also hear it,
Okay.
and think about it and respond.
So let me start with the simpler ones first, Bob, to give you some reassurance, I guess. So existing PUDs, they're grandfathered in, and the status of the master plan, the hospital example, for instance, it's a master plan that's recognized under their Act 250 permit. I don't think we're proposing to interfere with that process in any way whatsoever. What I would say there is, if the hospital was to want to significantly expand or acquire new properties on the fringe or whatever, then that may present us with some issues down the road. But basically, any existing PUD, as long as the holder of the PUD permit wants to keep it that way, they're good to go. We do actually think that there's some possibilities where an existing PUD holder may choose to actually opt out of it because they will experience more flexibility in some regards with a new one. So on balance, though, we think that large institutional settings with a campus-style arrangement, such as the high school and the hospital, we don't expect this to really impact them in the foreseeable future. So,
And again, well, we can have the
yeah,
discussion,
but
because it might be good to clarify that, because we say we
Yeah, it
think we own
depends.
it by right, but I don't think it's not written in there.
It depends on what draft you reviewed,
Oh, okay.
because we have addressed it.
right,
Okay.
yeah.
Maybe we have another
Yeah.
version.
So
You might have
the later
another
version
version.
addresses it directly.
And also to that point, we've also amended the slopes to 30% or more as not being developable.
So we gave you 5% straight off the top, okay? So
Right off the top.
right off the top, okay, just tonight. And then the question of multiple ownership. We're silent on ownership, and we're explicitly silent on ownership. It's not about ownership of the PUD. So any condominium arrangement or any other shared ownership arrangement, we're not interested in the ownership of the land. We're interested in the permit that controls the development of the land, and so it can be held by multiple owners. There's no.
So we'll have to look at that. Yeah, 'cause
Yeah,
I think when
there's
we
no
were
res-
under campus development, we thought it had to be as enjoyable.
No.
We'll look at it too.
And we're fine to. We'll confirm that. But that's definitely my sense of it is that
Yeah.
that the ownership question doesn't come up for us at all,
Yeah,
which means it can be multiple owners.
sure.
And then to go back to the broader kind of conceptual discussions about the PUD, I think I've actually had this conversation with Craig a little bit at various times. In almost every example that you gave, it's not conclusive, but almost every example, we're actually talking about large parcels that are sit on the boundary between two zoning districts. And so, and in the instance of both the Austin School, which is, one example, but more particularly the Grafton Cheese site, they actually perform important gateway functions as large properties. And so there's a substantial community dimension there of input, and then there's also some more complex development questions. And I'd say in that instance, I would offer with all, and very humbly at this point, because it's something that we obviously haven't been able to test, but I would offer that in those circumstances, you could process it as a zoning change and then employ one of the new PUD approaches that we would offer, and the scale and the significance of those developments it might be such that it's more straightforward in a way to actually do the zoning change first and then consider the next step, which is the precise permitting process that you'd employ. And I think that I had in discussions with Craig,
Yeah.
that was a particularly drawn out and fairly contentious affair, and there's a lot of things contained in that, including the historic nature of the the original structure and so forth that has been preserved, that have added complexity that, setting aside our local regulations, much of the effort and energy that went into the permitting process there was as a consequence of meeting Act 250 criteria. So, from us, I think that, we're open
Right,
to that kind of a
right.
problem-solving approach.
And as you say, there is a solution, which is, right now our PUD is a zoning change.
Right. bakes
But it just bakes it into the process to say you can do this. So to remove that and then go through a zoning change, we think has some challenges to it. So why don't we talk about that next week? But
Sure.
I think that, to go back to retreat for the benefit of everybody else here, there's now contemplation of having uses in there that would probably not fit in any zoning district between, the light industrial, restaurant, retail, cultural facility. Again, we're looking at, and I look at that and we're, in the process of sort of developing that project. I'm saying, I don't think there's anything wrong with this, if the community would support it, but I'm a little concerned at the framework of picking a zone for that and saying, okay, now we're gonna move that to, I'm not sure, what is it, institutional, this one?
It's,
The retreat.
the retreat is currently institutional.
Institutional,
Yes.
Which is good, it has a lot of flexibility.
Right, and it's
I think
been
the
in-
current
And it's got a basket.
PUD is okay.
Right,
So we'll be okay, we'll fit within that.
right, and the
But
master,
if the existing PUD didn't exist, I'd be in trouble. That's what I'm getting at.
uh,
I'm gonna be in trouble.
no, I don't, well,
So
I
there.
don't necessarily think so. I think in that instance, we would encourage you to opt for the rural enterprise PUD, which has a broad range of uses that
I
as a
haven't seen
template.
that one.
That's
Yeah,
it,
it's a newer one.
it's a newer one. So,
Well, these guys, they really need to talk.
so,
We can use an updated set of
so,
plans.
yeah, that's
I
been
like the sound
around.
of that.
That's been around for a couple of months now. So,
We don't have that one in our book.
when we had we've had meetings about that site, and that was one of our responses, that we think that there is a range of uses that go to preserve and maintain the economic viability of the working landscape, but that individually each one of those uses might be a challenge for one zoning district, and the approach that we would recommend and suggest is the rural enterprise PUD. And
Oh, good. So let's-
we've looked at that, and we think that the existing PUD would translate to the rural enterprise PUD easily, and we think that there may be some benefits to actually adopting that. So, yeah,
Oh, good. Look
yeah.
forward to looking at it.
okay. And so the only other broad comment about or response to Bob's broad concerns is that we've tried really hard not just to update the land use regulations and adopt current best practices as we understand them across the country and particularly in Vermont, but we've also tried to revolutionize the appearance of the document by using Word and a computer to format it, and so
That helps.
which has been a big help. And so it's graphically rich, and it uses formatting and a pretty rigorous table of contents that's well structured and rigorously designed sections so that it's easy to follow and easy to read. And we've made conscious choices to use plain English wherever possible. And so we don't guarantee that it's necessarily shorter than the combined set of regulations that we're living with now, but we do guarantee that it's easier to follow and easier to understand. Some of the concepts are new, and some of them will require some level of familiarization on the part of both professionals and private property owners who encounter it for the first time. But we think that the use of graphics, the use of tables, and the sidebar explanation and definition boxes are all intended to actually make the document more user-friendly. Lastly, on that point, this is basically the guidebook that forms the basis for this code in many ways. This is what Brandy and the Planning Commission and our office have used as sort of the framework for our own regulations. And it's important point that they make early on, which is if you want to spend a lot of time in court having judges and attorneys figure out what you mean, then you should write a very short set of land use regulations. So the shorter it is, the less definitive it is, and then you'll be in the hands of somebody else defining it for you. And so I would counter the complexity and gee, it's a really long document charge with we have made conscious choices to go long and be very detailed and be very explicit and very clear, because we want the community's expectations and standards to be embodied in the code and then implemented. We don't want it to be reinterpreted by judicial or legal entities outside the community. And the thing I want to leave you with there is a very specific picture, which is a large developer of commercial real estate or something similar comes to town and proposes a project and finds shortcomings in the land use regulations, and then has the resources to actually take the community to court and pick it apart. Yeah. And you've just wasted a substantial amount of the very precious resource, which is the community's commitment to what you want to do. And so we could be redirected basically by interests that are not from or about Brattleboro. And so we've made a conscious choice to build a comprehensive code, and unfortunately what that means is it's not really short, and it's not really simple, but there's a very important explanation as to why it's not.
I think I would add to that, Rod, that we're also, applicants should be able to know up front before they enter the development review process what their expectations are for them. When there's a lot of very qualitative language, they can get well into the development review process and be surprised by requirements or standards that are going to be placed on them or how things are going to be interpreted. So, we've tried to go to more quantitative standards in many places to the extent that we can. So things like the landscaping, for instance, I think is a good example of that, and the lighting, to try to, and that does add to the complexity and the length of it, but, for people with larger projects that are going to have professionals working with them, they should be able to go through this upfront and have a pretty clear understanding of exactly what they need to do to get through the process in an efficient manner.
No, go ahead.
Well, no, you go.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say that what I got out of the last half an hour of this meeting was that I think you're closer than you think you are.
We're ready for conversation.
And then, the complexities are gonna, the minutiae and all that stuff are gonna work out with a good conversation with the development community and the new rewrite of, because you're probably working off of, wrong information. And so it was great that, we got this out in the open right now. I think the last half an hour was very, very eye-opening for me, and settling that that we are closer than I think we are.
Dave?
Yeah, and I don't see a contradiction between what you just said, Russ, about avoiding litigation and having a comprehensive document and the points that have been raised tonight.
Yeah.
Anything else from anybody else? Well, this is exactly what I was hoping to achieve as well. I mean, I know you all are gonna have a dialogue at the planning commission level, but we've been deeply involved in getting up to speed here at the select board and hearing the dialogue begin between the group that's been looking at changes and the folks who've been drafting the document is very important for us. It's been important, I think, individually for each of the select board members, and I too see much more common ground than separation. It's really a very different set of comments that was given here than what we heard 3 weeks ago at the end of the meeting. And all I can say is that I'm not hearing that anybody, or that the primary working group that's been looking at it and the people who've been writing it think that this is overall problem, but rather there's tweaking to be done and some conceptual issues to be dealt with. And I want to thank you all for working on it and for coming and having this dialogue in public in the first instance with us here to listen to it, because it really helped us as well. I do think that the time frame that you discussed is realistic unless anybody on the board thinks otherwise. And I mean, my only question was whether you can do it in July and August rather than August and August, but it may not be possible since July starts tomorrow.
That's
But
what
it
we
lasts a
felt.
whole month.
Right.
Well, because there's the meeting on the planning commission has their meeting Monday night, and we know we're gonna be talking with the
Right.
working group, and to have time to think about it, make changes if
Right.
that's.
And we will then certainly be willing to move into our consideration process into September and October as the budget process just begins to unfold, and hopefully we can be moving
And
towards
we can try
approval.
for extra
Right,
meetings.
we felt that we wanted to hear from this group
Yeah.
this next week and then have some time to process that and maybe even go backwards and forwards a little bit.
Yep.
It may
You'll let
involve
us know.
scheduling an extra planning commission meeting.
Yep.
And we would love to finish sooner rather than later, but I think realistically,
Yeah.
we don't wanna, you would rather come in earlier, but not come in later.
Yeah. Well, I
Well,
think
we'd rather
that,
come in
yeah.
correct.
Well, I think that it also
Honestly,
bears
yeah.
mentioning that over the course of the last 2 months, Select Board has spent about 10 hours, probably more than 10 hours.
10 hours last time.
Well, but I'm talking 10 hours specifically going over the zoning ordinance in a range of different theme-related areas. And I think that we've really got a very solid understanding now of what's sought to be accomplished. And we'll look forward to continuing the dialogue and then to final adoption after the thing is amended to deal with any remaining issues. So I want to thank everybody for their work.
Very good.
Anything further at the meeting tonight?
Randy, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
We're ready for motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We have motion to adjourn. Any discussion? Hearing none of those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed or abstaining? That carries 5-0. Thank you, BCTV, the sole camera operator. Thank you for anybody who's been watching. Thank you for anybody who's going to watch in the future. Good night.